In 1904, 3 men from the Seneca reservation launched their canoes into the waters of Niagara, searching for the last autumn salmon before the frosts. They carried hemp nets and resin-soaked torches, but found only silence too deep for the river and fog that enveloped Goat Island thicker than any savannah. What rose from that water vapor left only hair on the rocks, bones in the whirlpool, and a memory that haunts me to this day. I was 34 when it happened. Our canoe was made of birch bark, 14 feet long, hollowed out and sewn together with spruce roots according to old custom. The bottom was covered with resin, black and sticky, which we renewed every year before the last catch. We carried 3 hemp nets with cedar bark floats, 6 torches soaked in spruce resin and wrapped in oiled cloth, 2 gaffs with iron hooks, a supply of dried venison wrapped in leather, and a pouch of kinikinik, a sacred mixture of tobacco and red willow bark that the elders carried for ceremonies. The oars were made of ash, polished smooth by decades of use, with handles darkened by sweat and fish oil. Thomas Cornplanter sat at the stern, steering the canoe with broad, measured strokes. He was 61 years old, his back straight, his gray hair braided into 2 plaits that hung down over his chest on top of his deerskin jacket. His face was lined with wrinkles as deep as furrows in a plowed field, and his hands were sinewy and strong, with calluses on his palms the size of coins. He knew every eddy and every current in these waters, and could read the surface of the river as others read books. I sat in the middle with the net on my lap, checking the knots and floats, feeling the familiar weight of the hemp in my hands. My fingers moved out of habit, finding every weak knot, every torn mesh. William Two Crows occupied the bow of the canoe, holding a gaff across his knees and peering into the fog with the impatient attention characteristic of youth. He was 15 years old, his shoulders already broad, but his movements still awkward, not polished by years of work. He wore his hair short, in the white man's style, which the elders did not like. But his eyes burned with fire when Thomas told old stories. We set off from the reservation shore around midnight, when the moon was at its zenith, hidden by clouds. The current carried us slowly toward Goat Island, the water flowing black and oily beneath the oars. The air smelled of dampness, rotting leaves, and that special freshness that comes before the first snow. The roar of the waterfall grew with each stroke until it filled the entire space, vibrating in our chests and skulls. Thomas said that salmon rise to the rapids before the waterfall at this time of year, gathering in deep pools before their final push upstream. We were looking for just such places. Whirlpools at the northern tip of the island, where the water swirled in deep funnels and the bottom dropped 20 feet or more. By 1 o'clock in the morning, we had rounded the western side of the island, staying close to the shore where the current was weaker. The rocks rose from the water in sharp teeth, covered with moss and slippery from constant water vapor. The trees on the shore, cedars and spruces, leaned over the water, their branches hanging low, touching the surface. The fog here was the thickest, enveloping the canoe in a dense veil through which the outlines of the shore were barely visible. Thomas guided us by memory, without looking at the water, as if reading a map written in his bones. I heard the splash of the oars, William's heavy breathing at the bow, my own heartbeat in my ears above the roar of the waterfall. The water was cold to the touch when I dipped my hand over the side to check the current. My fingers went numb in seconds. We passed the first whirlpool, where the surface swirled in slow spirals, but Thomas shook his head and rowed on. He said the water was too fast here, that salmon didn't stand in such a current. William lowered his torch to the water, the flame reflecting on the black surface as a yellow spot, but it did not illuminate the depths. We moved along the shore for another half hour, skirting rocky outcrops and thickets of reeds that stuck out of the water with stiff stems. The night was quiet, except for the waterfall. There were no birds to be heard. There was no wind, only fog, water, and a hum. By 2 o'clock, we reached the northern tip of the island, where the river split before the waterfall. Here, the current created a deep whirlpool that spun counterclockwise, forming a funnel in the center. Rocks surrounded this place in a semicircle, sharp and black, covered with water vapor and moss. Thomas said that salmon gathered here before dawn, resting in the calm water at the edge of the funnel. We slowed down. William raised the torch higher, illuminating the surface. The water here was as smooth as glass in the center of the whirlpool, but at the edges it swirled in rapid spirals. The depth, I knew, was 25 feet or more. We cast the first net, the hemp rustling as it unfolded in the air, the floats hitting the surface with a soft splash. I held the end, feeling the tension as the net went deep, pulled down by the stone weights. Thomas kept the canoe in place, working the paddle with slight adjustments. William leaned over the side, peering into the water, holding the torch so low that the flame almost touched the surface. We waited, counting the beats of our hearts. The net tightened and I felt a tug. Fish. I began to pull, the hemp cutting into my palms through the calluses. Thomas rowed closer to the center, giving me slack. I had pulled the net halfway out when I sensed something was wrong. The water around us had become too smooth. The current swirling at the edge of the whirlpool slowed, then stopped completely. The surface froze in a 50-foot radius around the canoe, as if someone had poured oil into the river. The fish stopped thrashing in the net. I stopped pulling, holding the hemp end in my hands, and looked at Thomas. He too was frozen, his paddle suspended above the water. His eyes were narrowed, his gaze wandering across the surface. William slowly straightened up, the torch trembling in his hand. The smell hit us next. Sharp and acrid, it cut through the dampness of the fog and the smell of the waterfall. It smelled like burnt skin, like after a fire when the flames had reached the flesh. Underneath that was another smell, rotting meat with a metallic tinge, copper or iron, as if someone had left a carcass to rot in a rusty cauldron. I grimaced, my breathing becoming shallower. Thomas drew air through his nose, his face unchanged, but his fingers tightened on the oar handle. William pinched his nose, the torch lowered. He said something in Seneca, the words lost in the roar of the waterfall, but I understood from the intonation that it was a question. Thomas replied briefly with one word. He shook his head. I returned to the net, pulling more slowly now, each knot passing through my fingers with effort. The water remained smooth. The smell lingered, hanging in the air like a heavy veil. The net appeared above the surface, empty. Not a single fish, only algae, black and slimy, wrapped around the hemp. I began to pick them out, throwing them back into the water. Thomas said we would move further downstream, where the whirlpool was weaker. William agreed quickly, too quickly. We began to row. The sound came when we were about 20 feet away from the whirlpool. A low hum, like distant thunder, but constant without rumblings. It vibrated in the air, penetrating the roar of the waterfall, different in tone, deeper, heavier. I stopped rowing and listened. The rumble lasted about 5 seconds, then faded away. Pause. I counted my heartbeats, 7. The rumble returned, now higher, turning into a howl. Not animal, not human. Something in between, making the bones in my skull vibrate. The sound came from somewhere above, from the mist above the water. I looked up, but saw only a white veil. Thomas froze, his oar suspended in the air, water dripping from the blade. William turned around. The torch swayed, the flame almost touching the side of the boat. The howl lasted longer this time, about 10 seconds, then broke off with a sharp crack like a bolt of lightning. The echo rolled off the rocks, mingled with the roar of the waterfall, and died away. We sat motionless, the canoe slowly spinning in the current. No one rowed. No one spoke. I could hear my own breathing, heavy and rapid, steam escaping from my mouth in short puffs. My hands trembled on the oar. Thomas stared into the mist above the water, his face motionless, but I could see the muscles in his neck tense. William pressed the torch to his chest, the flame lighting his face from below, his eyes wide. Thomas whispered that we had to row to shore. Now, I agreed without asking why. We turned the canoe around. William grabbed an oar and began to row from the bow. The shore was about 50 feet away, the rocks looming through the fog like dark masses. I rowed with all my might, the oars cutting into the water with heavy splashes. Thomas worked at the stern, keeping us on course. The canoe moved quickly, the bow cutting through the smooth surface, leaving a trail of ripples behind us. We were halfway there when we saw the light. 2 dim red lights appeared in the fog about 8 feet above the water. They moved slowly, approaching in a spiral, circling our canoe. They did not flicker or sway. They burned with an even light, like coals in a hearth when the wood has already burned out. The distance between them was about 3 feet, and they moved in sync, as if tied to a single point. I stopped paddling and watched the lights. They passed to our left, about 20 feet away, then turned and began to circle again. William turned around and raised his torch high. The flame lit up the fog, but the lights did not approach, remaining at the same distance. Thomas told us to row, not to stop. His voice was steady, but I heard something in it. Not fear, but caution, deep knowledge. We resumed our movement, the oars cutting through the water with redoubled force. The lights continued to circle, approaching slowly, the spiral narrowing. I could see them out of the corner of my eye, 2 red spots in the white fog. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest that the pain radiated to my ribs. My mouth was dry. The shore was now about 20 feet away, the rocks looming more clearly, the moss on them glistening with moisture. The next morning, when we returned with the other men from the reservation, we found what we were looking for on the rocks by the whirlpool. Long black hair, each strand 2 or 3 feet long, was stuck between the rocks on the shore. It was as thick as horsehair, but stiff and oily to the touch, slipping between my fingers and leaving a dark residue. I picked up a strand and stretched it between my hands. It was strong, not breaking even when I pulled with all my might. It had the same smell, burnt flesh and rotting meat. Thomas gathered several strands, wrapped them in leather and hid them in a bag. He said the elders needed to see them. Further along the shore, where the rocks formed a small niche above the water, we found bones. Human bones I recognized by their shape. A thigh bone, several ribs, part of a skull, all gnawed on, with deep grooves that didn't match the teeth of any animal I knew. The size of the bites indicated a jaw with a diameter of 3 or 4 feet. The bones were old, bleached by the sun and water, but not so old that they were crumbling. A year, maybe 2? Thomas crouched down beside them, studying them silently. His fingers trembled slightly as he touched the skull. He said he knew who the bones belonged to. A boy from the reservation had disappeared 2 years ago while fishing alone at the waterfall. The body had not been found then, but that was in the morning. At night, everything happened differently. The lights in the fog stopped, hovering about 30 feet from the canoe. We were 10 feet from the shore, the oars already touching the bottom, scraping against the rocks. Thomas shouted to pull the canoe onto the rocks. William jumped into the water first. It came up to his knees. The cold made him gasp. I followed. My feet went numb instantly. The boulders under my feet were slippery. We grabbed the sides and pulled. The canoe moved slowly, its bottom scraping against the rocks with a dull, grinding sound. Thomas stayed inside, holding the torch and the boat hook, staring into the fog. The lights moved. Quickly, straight toward us. The distance closed to 20 feet in seconds. I could see more now. The shape around the lights. A huge head, 5 feet in diameter, the size of a large barrel. It hovered in the air 7 feet above the water, slowly rotating. The skin was dark gray, wrinkled, covered with spots that looked like burns. The lights were eyes. Huge, the size of a man's fist, glowing dimly red from within. No eyelids. Constantly open, looking straight at us. The nose was almost absent, just 2 wide nostrils from which steam escaped in short bursts. The mouth was closed, but I could see its size. It took up the entire lower half of the face. Hair radiated out from the head in all directions. Hundreds of strands, each 6 or 8 feet long, as thick as a finger. They moved, writhing like living snakes, spreading out in all directions, reaching toward the water. They did not flutter in the wind. There was no wind. They moved on their own, independently of each other. I stood waist-deep in the water, holding onto the side of the canoe, unable to look away. Where the neck should have been, I could see torn flesh with protruding vertebrae, but no blood. It was as if the head had been torn from the body and healed that way. The creature made a sound, a low hum that turned into a howl, then a roar. The sound came from all sides at once, the echoes from the rocks and the waterfall amplifying it to unbearable levels. The bones in my skull vibrated, my teeth chattered. I covered my ears with my palms, but the sound penetrated them, filling my head. William screamed, but I couldn't hear his voice over the howling. Thomas stood in the canoe, holding a torch in front of him, the flame seeming pitiful in front of that head. The creature lowered itself, almost to the surface of the water. Its hair sank, spreading out in circles across the water. I saw them moving beneath the surface, writhing like tentacles. One of them wrapped itself around a large salmon that was thrashing about in panic. The hair tightened, and the fish stopped moving. The head rose higher, its mouth opening. I saw 3 rows of sharp triangular teeth like a shark's. Inside its mouth glowed red like red-hot metal. The hair pulled the salmon toward its mouth. The teeth closed. Bones crunched. The fish was torn in half, blood splattering the water in black drops. The head swallowed both halves without chewing. We didn't move. We stood waist-deep in the water, holding onto the canoe, watching. The creature slowly circled around us, about 20 feet away. It rose and fell, its hair reaching toward the water, toward us. Its eyes didn't blink, they watched. They studied. I saw my reflection in them. A tiny figure frozen in fear. My chest tightened. My breathing became shallow. My knees trembled. Thomas whispered something in the Seneca language. A prayer, perhaps. Or a curse. The creature moved. Swiftly, without warning, it lunged at the canoe, its hair shooting forward like spears. William screamed, tried to jump away, but the water held him. Hair wrapped around his right arm, another around his neck. The boy grabbed them with his free hand, trying to pull them off, but they wouldn't budge. Thick as ropes, slippery and strong. They pulled. William rose out of the water, about 4 feet above the surface. His legs dangled, his hands tore at his hair. The scream was piercing, cutting through his ears. Thomas threw the gaff. The iron hook struck the side of his head and bounced off without leaving a mark. I rushed to William, grabbed his leg, and hung on it with all my weight. The hair did not loosen. 2 more wrapped around the boy's chest and tightened. I heard a rib crack. The scream grew louder, then broke off and turned into a gurgle. The creature turned and carried William toward the center of the whirlpool. I lost my grip and fell into the water. I came up coughing, water filling my mouth. Thomas was shouting the boy's name. The creature lowered William to the surface of the whirlpool. Its head bent over him, its mouth opening wide. I saw teeth, a red glow from within. The hair pushed the boy right into its mouth. The jaws closed. I turned away. I heard a crunch, a splash, then silence, broken only by the roar of the waterfall. When I looked again, the creature had disappeared under the water. The surface of the whirlpool was churning. A red light glowed in the depths, then went out. William was gone. Only ripples on the water spread out in circles, then disappeared. Thomas stood in the canoe, his arms down, the torch almost touching the bottom. His face was like stone. I approached the canoe, climbed inside, water dripping from my clothes in puddles. My hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't hold the oar. Thomas told me to row. His voice was dead, empty. I took the oar and began to work. Thomas rowed at the stern, slowly, methodically. We sailed away from the whirlpool, staying close to the shore. The water was black. The fog enveloped us more densely than before. I looked back every few strokes, looking at the whirlpool. Nothing, only a smooth surface. We had gone 100 feet when the creature returned. It rose from the water behind us, its head hovering 8 feet above us. Its eyes glowed brighter now, its hair spread out like a fan, drops falling from it like rain. It let out a howl. Rolls of thunder that rolled down the river, bounced off the rocks and returned as an echo. I rowed faster, the oars cutting desperately into the water. Thomas didn't look back, working steadily, but I could see the knuckles on his oar handle turn white. The creature followed us. It didn't get closer, keeping a distance of about 30 feet. It moved silently, only its hair rustling in the water. Sometimes it sank closer to the surface. Sometimes it rose higher. Its eyes never left us. I felt its gaze on my back, heavy as physical pressure. My chest tightened so much that breathing became painful. Sweat ran down my face, mixing with the water vapor and stinging my eyes. Thomas put down his paddle, his hands shaking. He took a bag of kinnikinnick from under his jacket and untied it with trembling fingers. He took a pinch of sacred tobacco and threw it into the water. Then another, and another. He began to sing an ancient protective song in the Seneca language. His voice was hoarse and trembling, but the words came out clear. I didn't understand them, but I recognized the rhythm. I had heard this song at ceremonies when the elders called for protection from evil spirits. I joined in the singing, not knowing the words, but imitating the intonation. My voice cracked, but I continued. Thomas threw tobacco into the water. Smoke rose from the pinches, mixing with the fog. The smell was sharp, sweetish, overpowering the smell of rot. The creature slowed down. It stopped. Its hair froze, stopped writhing. Its head swayed as if in doubt. Thomas sang louder, his voice growing stronger. He threw tobacco with broad gestures, the smoke enveloping the canoe in a light veil. I rowed with one hand and helped scatter the tobacco with the other. The creature recoiled, abruptly as if struck. It rose higher, about 10 feet above the water. It let out a final howl, deafening, full of rage and pain. The sound was so loud that I covered my ears, the paddle falling from my hands. Then the creature turned and rushed away. Its hair fluttered behind it like a cloak. It disappeared into the mist above the waterfall, the red light of its eyes flickering for another second, then vanishing. We sat in the canoe, motionless. Our breathing was heavy, our hearts pounding. Thomas clutched the tobacco pouch in his hand, his knuckles white. I stared into the fog where the creature had disappeared. Nothing. Only the waterfall, its roar now soothing. I picked up the paddle, my hands shaking so much that I almost dropped it again. We rowed to the shore, slowly, each stroke requiring effort. We pulled the canoe onto the rocks and tied it to a cedar tree. We sat on the rocks until dawn, without lighting a fire or saying a word. We just looked at the water and listened to the waterfall. At first light, we returned to the reservation. We gathered the elders and told them what we had seen. Thomas showed them the hair he had found on the rocks later. The council believed him. Ancient legends about the flying head were well known among the Seneca. A spiritual entity, a severed head that hunts at night by the water and devours people. Tabak Kinikinik was a traditional protection against evil spirits. The fact that it worked confirmed the story. The elders banned night fishing at the waterfall. They declared the whirlpool at the northern tip of Goat Island to be a place of evil spirits. No sign was posted. Our people knew the oral tradition, but the white authorities in Buffalo and Niagara Falls heard a different story. The boy drowned, swept away by the current, his body lost in the whirlpool. An accident. The dangers of night fishing. They didn't listen to the story of the flying head. They called it superstition, Indian fairy tales. An anthropologist came a month later. Arthur Parker, a young man, was studying Seneca culture. I gave him my testimony. I told him everything as it was. He wrote it down in his notebook, nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me. For him, it was folklore, a legend to be recorded in a book alongside other stories. Not reality. Years later, he published my story in a collection of Iroquois myths and legends. I read that publication. The words were mine, but the meaning was distorted. It became a fairy tale. Thomas lived another 12 years after that night. His hair turned completely white in a week. He no longer fished at night, even when others called him. Every autumn, he performed a protective ritual at the waterfall, burning kinikinik, singing ancient songs, warning young people to stay away from the whirlpool. He taught them the words of the protective song and explained how to use sacred tabak. In 1916, he died in his sleep, quietly, surrounded by his family. But until his last day, when he heard the wind howling at night, he would wake up and grab the bag of tabak that he always kept under his pillow. As for me, I never fished at night again. Not at the waterfall, not on the river, not on the lake. Even during the day, when I approached the water, I looked at the surface with apprehension, searching for red light beneath the waves. I became one of the elders of the reservation, the keeper of the memory of flying head. I told the story to the young people, warned them. Some listened. Some laughed behind my back, thinking I was an old fool, frightened by shadows. William's mother, whose name was Mary Two Crows, came to the waterfall every year on the day of his disappearance. She brought tabak, burned it on the rocks, and sang memorial songs in the Seneca language. She stood there for hours, watching the whirlpool, waiting for the waters to return her son. They did not. She died in 1923, her heart giving out. She was buried in the reservation cemetery, next to the empty grave dug for William. Without a body, I lived until 1947. I saw how the world changed. Cars replaced horses, electricity came to the reservation, young people began to speak more English than Seneca, but the waterfall remained the same. Its roar, its mist, its whirlpools. And I know that Flying Head is still there, deep down, where the water is black and cold. Waiting, I wrote this story down, even though I know few will believe it entirely. White people will read it as folklore. Scientists will read it as superstition. But I am not writing for them. I am writing for those who come to the falls at night, who hear the howling through the roar of the water, who smell the scent of burnt flesh in the mist. For them, I leave this warning. Stay away from the whirlpool at the northern tip of Goat Island. Wear kinikinik if you go to the water in the dark. Learn the protective song. And remember, some places do not belong to us. And I know that if I ever hear that sound again, the howl that turns into a roar and makes your bones vibrate, if I see two red lights floating in the fog above the black water, no map, no order, no promise will make me stay. Because I have seen the flying head. I know it's real, and I know it's hungry.